Cedar Grove was like any other small town in America, where everyone knew everyone and secrets were supposedly hard to keep. The town sat nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, with a main street lined by brick buildings that had stood for generations. At first glance, it seemed picture-perfect, but beneath the surface, something dark was brewing. Sheriff James Miller was the kind of man people naturally trusted. Tall and well-built, with graying hair at his temples that only added to his authoritative presence, he'd served the community for over 15 years. He was the face of law and order, often seen at community events, high school football games, and local fundraisers. His warm smile and firm handshake made everyone feel safe. "You can always count on Sheriff Miller," people would say, and they meant it. Living on the other side of town was Maria Johnson, a bright 16-year-old who stood out not just for her academic achievements, but for her determination to make something of herself. She lived with her hard-working mother in a modest house near the railroad tracks. Despite their financial struggles, Maria maintained perfect grades and actively participated in the school's mock trial team. Her teachers often remarked that she had a natural talent for debate and law. The paths of the sheriff and Maria first crossed at a career day event at Cedar Grove High School. Maria's thoughtful questions about law enforcement caught the sheriff's attention. What started as seemingly innocent mentorship soon raised eyebrows among a few observant members of the community. Deputy Thomas was the first to notice something wasn't quite right. He'd catch glimpses of the sheriff's patrol car parked near the high school during odd hours. The sheriff's sudden interest in personally handling school security matters seemed out of character. When questioned, Miller always had a ready explanation about community outreach and mentoring programs. The town's coffee shop became a hub of whispered conversations. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the place for 30 years, noticed the sheriff would often be there when Maria stopped by after school for her part-time job. Their interactions seemed casual enough, but something in Mrs. Peterson's gut told her something wasn't right. Maria's best friend noticed changes too. The new clothes, the expensive phone she suddenly had, and the way she'd become secretive about her afternoons. When asked, Maria would brush it off with a laugh, saying she'd picked up extra shifts at work. But her laughter didn't reach her eyes anymore. Meanwhile, Sheriff Miller's wife noticed his late nights becoming more frequent. He blamed it on increased drug activity in the county, but the station logs told a different story. When she tried to discuss it, he'd become defensive and withdraw further. The autumn air grew colder as tensions silently built in Cedar Grove. Maria's mother noticed her daughter becoming increasingly withdrawn, spending more time alone in her room. The once outspoken teenager who dreamed of becoming a lawyer now barely spoke during dinner. At school, Maria's grades began to slip. Her English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, tried to reach out, but Maria had built walls around herself. The spark that once lit up her eyes during class discussions had dimmed, replaced by a distant look that seemed to carry the weight of secrets too heavy for a 16-year-old to bear. The truth was building like pressure in a sealed container, waiting to explode. Cedar Grove's perfect facade was about to crack, revealing the darkness that had been growing in its shadows. Nobody realized that these early warning signs were just the beginning of a story that would shake their community to its core and force them to question everything they thought they knew about trust, power, and justice. As autumn turned to winter, the stage was set for a tragedy that would forever change Cedar Grove. The small town that prided itself on being a safe haven would soon learn that sometimes the greatest threats come from those sworn to protect it. The signs became impossible to ignore as winter settled over Cedar Grove. Sheriff Miller's presence at the high school had grown so frequent that even the most oblivious teachers started to take notice. He claimed it was part of a new safety initiative, but his eyes always seemed to find their way to Maria's classroom. Deputy Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One evening, while filing reports, he noticed a pattern in the sheriff's patrol logs, frequent stops near Maria's neighborhood, well outside his usual routes. When confronted, Miller brushed it off with a laugh, saying he was just keeping an extra eye on the troubled areas of town. Maria's transformation became more apparent with each passing day. The girl who once raised her hand for every question now slumped in her back row seat, wearing long sleeves even on warm days. Her mother noticed money appearing mysteriously, new clothes, expensive makeup, things they could never afford on their tight budget. When questioned, Maria would mumble something about babysitting jobs, but the explanation felt hollow. The school counselor, Mrs. Chen, tried to reach out after Maria's grades plummeted from straight A's to barely passing. During their meeting, Maria sat with her arms crossed, answering in single words, her eyes fixed on the floor. When Mrs. Chen gently asked about the changes in her behavior, Maria's hands began to shake. Before any real conversation could happen, a call came from the front office. Sheriff Miller was there to speak with Maria about a community outreach program. At the local diner, whispers began to circulate. The waitresses noticed how Miller would show up during Maria's shifts, sitting in her section, leaving generous tips. They saw how she would freeze like a deer in headlights whenever his patrol car pulled into the parking lot. One evening, a waitress saw them in his car behind the diner, but when she approached, he quickly drove away. Maria's best friend noticed the constant text messages, how Maria would jump every time her phone buzzed. Sometimes during lunch, she'd catch Maria wiping away tears while staring at her phone screen. When asked about it, Maria would quickly force a smile and change the subject. The breaking point came during a routine traffic stop. Deputy Thomas pulled over a speeding car only to find Maria in the passenger seat, with Sheriff Miller behind the wheel. It was well past midnight on a school night. When Thomas approached the window, Miller flashed his badge and said it was official business. The look of fear in Maria's eyes told a different story. The next day, Thomas noticed that the dashcam footage from his patrol car had been deleted. When he tried to file a report, he found himself suddenly reassigned to the graveyard shift. The message was clear: keep quiet or face consequences. Meanwhile, Maria's mother began finding disturbing changes in her daughter's behavior. The once outgoing teenager now jumped at small noises. She stopped attending her beloved mock trial club and withdrew from her friends. Most worrying were the hushed phone conversations that ended abruptly whenever anyone entered the room. At school, rumors started spreading. Other students noticed the special treatment Maria received from the sheriff's office, getting out of minor infractions, never receiving tardy slips despite being consistently late. Some jealously called her the sheriff's pet, not realizing the dark truth behind their teasing. The town's moral compass was spinning, but nobody wanted to be the first to speak up. It was easier to look away, to pretend everything was normal in their perfect little town. But beneath the surface, pressure was building. Cedar Grove was sitting on a powder keg of secrets, and it would only take one spark to blow everything apart. As Christmas lights went up around town, darkness was growing in Maria's world. The weight of secrets was becoming too heavy to bear, and soon, a revelation would come that would shatter Cedar Grove's peaceful facade forever. The true test of the community's character was approaching. Would they stand up for what's right, or continue to look the other way? The news hit Cedar Grove like a thunderbolt on a clear day. It started as a whisper in the school hallways, then spread through the grocery store aisles, and finally exploded during Sunday service. Maria Johnson was pregnant, and rumors pointed directly at Sheriff Miller. The town split faster than a dry log under an axe. Some folks, mostly those in Miller's inner circle, rushed to defend him. "It's impossible," they said over coffee at the local diner. "He's a family man, a pillar of the community." Others remembered the lingering looks, the patrol car parked near the school, the special attention that had seemed odd but not quite criminal at the time. Maria's mother, learning the truth from a positive pregnancy test hidden in her daughter's drawer, fell into a deep despair that quickly turned to rage. She marched straight to the town council meeting, her voice shaking but strong as she demanded justice. The room fell silent as she spoke, her words cutting through years of willful ignorance. But Miller had friends in high places. The local judge, who played golf with him every Sunday, suddenly became unavailable for meetings. The district attorney, who owed his election to Miller's endorsement, cited insufficient evidence and dragged his feet on filing charges. Deputy Thomas found himself increasingly isolated at the station. His fellow officers, once friendly colleagues, now passed him in silence. His case files kept disappearing, his reports were misplaced, and one morning he found his tires slashed in the station parking lot. The message was clear: loyalty to the badge came first. The high school became a battlefield of whispers and pointed fingers. Some students, parroting their parents' opinions, blamed Maria. She must have led him on, they said, as if that could justify anything. Others, remembering her transformation from confident student to withdrawn shadow, stood firmly in her defense. Maria stopped coming to school altogether. Her mother would pick up her assignments, returning later with completed work, her face drawn and tired. The few friends who tried to visit were turned away. The bright future that had once seemed so certain for Maria now hung by a thread. The local newspaper, run by old friends of Miller's family, buried the story on page 6 between a bake sale announcement and the weekly weather report. But social media couldn't be controlled so easily. Posts began circulating, sharing old photos of Miller at school events, his hand resting just a bit too long on young shoulders. Town meetings became heated battlegrounds. Mrs. Peterson, the coffee shop owner, stood up one evening and recounted every suspicious interaction she'd witnessed. Her voice grew stronger as others joined in, sharing their own stories of things they'd seen but hadn't understood at the time. Miller's wife stopped attending church, tired of the pitying looks and whispered conversations that died when she approached. Their teenage daughter transferred to a private school 2 towns over, unable to bear the weight of her father's actions. The turning point came when Deputy Thomas, despite the threats and isolation, took his evidence to the state police. External investigators arrived in unmarked cars, their presence sending ripples through the community. They set up in the motel on the edge of town, conducting interviews and collecting statements. Miller maintained his innocence, appearing on the local news with his lawyer, playing the role of the wrongly accused public servant. But his confident smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore, and people began to notice the sweat on his forehead under the TV lights. The pregnancy couldn't be hidden forever, and neither could the truth. DNA doesn't lie, and Miller's power began to crumble. His supporters grew quieter, their defenses weaker. The same people who had once praised him at community gatherings now crossed the street to avoid meeting him. Cedar Grove was learning a harsh lesson about the price of silence. The comfortable illusion of their perfect small town had been shattered, revealing the rot that had been growing beneath the surface. As winter turned to spring, the community faced a choice: continue to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable, or stand up and demand justice, no matter the cost. The story was far from over, and darker chapters were yet to come. But the truth, once spoken, couldn't be buried again. Cedar Grove would never be the same, and maybe, some whispered, that wasn't such a bad thing. The state investigation hit Cedar Grove like a hurricane, turning over every stone and exposing secrets long buried. State police officers, wearing suits instead of uniforms, became a common sight around town. They carried badges that didn't shine as brightly as Sheriff Miller's, but their authority cut deeper. The investigators set up their command center in an empty storefront downtown. Local folks watched through the windows as they pinned photos and documents to the walls, creating a web of evidence that grew more complex by the day. The sight of Miller's face at the center of their investigation board sent chills through the community. The station house, once Miller's fortress, became a battleground of loyalties. Officers who had served under him for years found themselves facing tough questions. Some broke down under pressure, admitting they'd helped cover up suspicious incidents. Others maintained their silence, but their sleepless nights showed on their faces. Deputy Thomas emerged as a key witness. In a recorded interview that lasted 6 hours, he detailed every suspicious incident he'd documented over the past year. The deleted dash cam footage, the manipulated patrol logs, the threatening notes left in his locker. His voice shook as he described the night he'd caught Miller with Maria in the car, but his words rang with truth. The investigators discovered a pattern that stretched back further than anyone had imagined. Old case files revealed complaints that had been buried, witnesses who had been intimidated into silence. Miller's power hadn't corrupted him. He'd sought power to enable his corruption. Maria's phone became a crucial piece of evidence. Hundreds of messages revealed the manipulation, the threats, the false promises. The investigators handled this evidence with particular care, knowing it could break the case wide open while protecting the young victim's privacy. The school's records told their own story. A steady decline in grades, missed classes that aligned perfectly with Miller's patrol schedule, counselors' notes expressing concern about behavioral changes. The pieces fit together like a jigsaw puzzle revealing a nightmare. Miller's wife finally broke her silence, speaking to investigators for hours behind closed doors. When she emerged, her eyes were red but her head was held high. That same afternoon, Miller came home to find the locks changed and divorce papers on the porch. The coffee shop became an unofficial hub for sharing information with the investigators. Mrs. Peterson had kept a diary of suspicious incidents, written in the margins of her order books. "I knew something wasn't right," she told them, "but I never imagined it was this bad." The investigation spread beyond Cedar Grove's borders. Other communities came forward with similar stories: young girls, powerful men, silent witnesses. The case was becoming bigger than one small town, revealing a system that protected predators instead of victims. Miller's lawyer tried to control the narrative, holding press conferences on the courthouse steps. But his polished words couldn't compete with the weight of evidence piling up. Each day brought new revelations, new witnesses, new charges. Maria's pregnancy progressed as the investigation continued. Her mother turned their home into a fortress, protecting her daughter from prying eyes and probing questions. The few glimpses townspeople caught of Maria showed a young girl carrying a burden no teenager should have to bear. The state prosecutors moved methodically, building their case brick by brick. They interviewed teachers, students, diner staff, gas station attendants, anyone who might have seen something. Small details became crucial evidence. A credit card receipt from a motel, a security camera footage from a convenience store, a worried text message sent months ago. The town held its breath as the investigation neared its conclusion. Miller remained free on bail, but his power was gone. His supporters dwindled to a handful of diehards who couldn't or wouldn't accept the truth. The rest of Cedar Grove watched and waited, knowing that justice was coming but fearing what other secrets might be exposed along the way. As spring approached, the investigators prepared to present their findings to a grand jury. The evidence was overwhelming, but nobody in Cedar Grove was celebrating. This wasn't a victory. It was a reckoning, a painful but necessary cleaning of a wound that had festered too long. The next phase would bring formal charges, a trial, and public exposure of every dirty detail. Cedar Grove would have to face its failure to protect one of its most vulnerable members. The real question wasn't about Miller's guilt anymore. It was about how the community would heal from this betrayal of trust. The stage was set for justice, but darker chapters still lay ahead. Nobody in Cedar Grove could have predicted just how tragic this story would become. The morning Maria disappeared shook Cedar Grove to its core. Her mother found her bed empty, window open, curtains dancing in the early spring breeze. The panic spread through town, faster than wildfire in dry grass. Even those who had doubted her story felt their hearts sink at the news. The state police moved swiftly, setting up a command center in the high school gymnasium. Search parties formed spontaneously. Neighbors who hadn't spoken since the scandal broke now stood shoulder to shoulder, clutching maps and flashlights. The spring air carried a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Miller was brought in for questioning immediately. He arrived at the station in a pressed suit, still playing the role of the wronged public servant. But this time, the mask slipped. When shown Maria's empty room photos, witnesses said his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. The search expanded outward from Maria's house like ripples in a pond. Volunteers combed through the woods behind the school, calling her name until their voices grew hoarse. Police dogs sniffed through the abandoned factory on the edge of town, their barks echoing off empty walls. Deputy Thomas worked without rest, fueled by coffee and guilt. "I should have done more," he kept saying as he retraced Miller's old patrol routes. Every abandoned building, every secluded spot where a patrol car might have stopped, all became potential crime scenes. The local news ran constant updates. Every few hours, a new detail emerged. Maria's phone had last pinged near the old bridge. Her winter coat was still in her closet. A neighbor's security camera had caught a dark SUV driving slowly past her house at 2 a.m. Miller's wife came forward with crucial information. Through tears, she revealed that Miller had emptied their joint savings account 2 days before Maria's disappearance. Their weekend cabin up in the mountains hadn't been visited in months, until last week, when Miller had gone there alone to clear his head. The discovery of Maria's backpack near Sawmill Creek sent a chill through the search teams. It lay half hidden under fallen leaves, her mock trial notes still inside, pages wrinkled from morning dew. The creek had swollen with spring rains, its waters dark and swift. As day turned to night, flashlight beams danced through the woods like desperate fireflies. Nobody wanted to stop searching, even as exhaustion set in. The town that had once turned a blind eye now refused to look away. Every parent held their children closer, knowing it could have been their child. The state police brought in specialized equipment, thermal cameras, underwater search gear. The creek bed was methodically searched, every fallen log and deep pool investigated. Each time the divers surfaced without news, the crowd on the banks held their breath, torn between hope and dread. Miller's calm facade finally cracked during his third interview. A detective noted how he kept checking his watch, his eyes darting to the window as if measuring the passing of time. When asked about the cabin, he claimed he'd lost the key months ago. A quick check proved this lie. The key was in his pocket. The break came from an unexpected source. A truck driver at the All Night Diner remembered seeing Miller's distinctive SUV heading toward the mountain roads the night Maria disappeared. He hadn't thought much of it then, but the image of a young girl's face on missing posters haunted him until he came forward. As police convoys raced toward the mountain cabin, Cedar Grove held its collective breath. Church bells rang, calling people to pray. The same pews that had once sheltered judgment now held hope and fear in equal measure. The cabin stood dark and silent against the mountainside, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to guard ancient secrets. As police approached, a single gunshot echoed through the valley. But this wasn't the end. It was just another twist in a story that had yet to reveal its darkest chapters. The community that had failed Maria in life now desperately hoped to find her alive. The weight of collective guilt hung heavy over Cedar Grove, a town learning too late that silence in the face of evil makes you complicit in its crimes. The search for Maria would reveal truths that would haunt Cedar Grove for generations. But for now, as darkness fell over the mountains, hope and fear danced together in the gathering shadows, waiting to see which would prove stronger. The next 24 hours would change everything. Cedar Grove would never be the same, and neither would anyone who called it home. The trial that shook Cedar Grove began on a crisp autumn morning. The courthouse steps, usually quiet, were crowded with news crews and spectators. Inside, the wooden benches creaked under the weight of a community seeking justice. Miller sat at the defense table, shoulders slumped, a shadow of the powerful man he'd once been. The gunshot at the cabin had been a failed attempt to escape justice. He'd survived, but the bullet had left him with a slight tremor in his right hand. His police uniform was replaced by an ill-fitting suit that seemed to hang on his frame. The evidence unfolded like chapters in a horror story. The prosecution methodically built their case, piece by haunting piece. The jury listened as forensics experts detailed their findings from the cabin. Each photograph, each piece of evidence, drew gasps from the courtroom crowd. Many had to leave, unable to bear the weight of the truth. Deputy Thomas's testimony lasted 2 full days. His voice never wavered as he recounted years of suspicious behavior, deleted reports, and covered up incidents. When asked why he finally came forward, he looked directly at Maria's mother and said, "Because someone had to stand up for what's right." The defense tried to paint Miller as a dedicated public servant pushed to the edge by false accusations, but their arguments fell apart under the prosecution's evidence. Bank records showed planned withdrawals. Cell phone data mapped out every movement. Security cameras had caught what Miller thought no one would ever see. Miller's wife testified against him, her voice steady despite her tears. She spoke of strange phone calls, unexplained absences, and a locked drawer in his office that she'd finally opened after his arrest. The contents of that drawer became evidence that even his own lawyer struggled to explain away. The hardest day came when they played the recordings. Maria's voice, captured on Miller's own dashcam, begging to go home. The courtroom fell silent except for muffled sobs. Even the court reporter had to pause to wipe her eyes. Local business owners testified about what they'd seen but never reported. Mrs. Peterson from the coffee shop brought years of handwritten notes documenting every suspicious interaction she'd witnessed. The school principal admitted to ignoring warning signs, his voice heavy with regret. The medical examiner's testimony silenced the courtroom. Clinical terms couldn't mask the horror of what had happened in that cabin. The jury members held their notebooks like shields, some unable to look at the evidence photos being presented. When the verdict came, it echoed through the courthouse like a thunderclap. Guilty on all counts. Miller stood motionless as the judge read out the charges, each one carrying decades of prison time. No one in Cedar Grove would ever have to fear him again. The sentencing hearing brought the town together one final time. Person after person stood to give impact statements, their words painting a picture of a community forever changed. Teachers spoke of empty seats in classrooms. Parents described their children's lost innocence. Young girls told of their own close calls with the man they'd been taught to trust. Maria's mother was the last to speak. She stood tall, her voice clear and strong as she addressed not just Miller, but the entire community. "My daughter dreamed of becoming a lawyer to help others find justice," she said. In her memory, we must ensure this never happens again. The judge's sentence was severe, multiple life terms with no possibility of parole. As Mill was led away in handcuffs, the town felt a collective exhale. But there was no celebration. How could there be when the price of justice had been so high? The courthouse steps became a memorial site. People left flowers, notes, and messages of hope. The same steps where Miller had once proudly worn his badge now bore witness to his final disgrace. Cedar Grove would never forget. The trial had exposed not just one man's crimes, but a whole system that had allowed them to happen. Changes began immediately: new oversight committees, mandatory reporting training, anonymous tip lines. Every policy was rewritten with the determination that no other child would ever suffer in silence. As the reporters packed up their cameras and the crowds dispersed, Cedar Grove faced its future with a new understanding. Justice had been served, but healing would take much longer. The town that had once prided itself on its secrets now vowed to stand in the light of truth, no matter how painful. The story of Cedar Grove became a warning to other communities about the cost of silence and the power of speaking up. But for those who lived through it, it would always be a reminder of what happens when good people look the other way for too long. 5 years after the trial, Cedar Grove had changed in ways both visible and invisible. The old police station was now a community center, its walls covered with children's artwork and posters promoting safety and awareness. The transformation wasn't just about the building, it represented a complete shift in how the town protected its most vulnerable members. Maria's mother channeled her grief into action, establishing a foundation in her daughter's name. The Maria Johnson Youth Safety Center became a haven for troubled teens, offering counseling, support groups, and education programs. The center's motto, "Speak Up, Stand Strong," became a rallying cry for the entire community. Deputy Thomas, now Chief Thomas, led the reformed police department with a focus on transparency and accountability. Every officer wore body cameras, and quarterly reviews were open to the public. The new policies he implemented became a model for other small towns across the state. The high school underwent its own revolution. Anonymous reporting systems were put in place, and students were taught about power dynamics and the importance of speaking up. The mock trial team, Maria's former passion, now competed in state championships wearing purple ribbons, her favorite color. Mrs. Peterson's coffee shop became more than just a place for morning coffee. She hosted monthly community meetings where people could voice concerns without fear. The walls displayed photos of local youth achievements, deliberately creating a space where young people felt seen and valued. The changes weren't always easy. Some old-timers resisted the new openness, preferring the comfort of the way things used to be. But the younger generation, having witnessed the cost of silence, embraced the transformation. They understood that true community safety meant watching out for each other. The memorial garden, planted where the old cabin had stood, bloomed with wildflowers every spring. Local schools took field trips there, not to dwell on tragedy, but to learn about resilience and the importance of standing up for what's right. The garden's centerpiece, a simple stone marker, read, "In memory of those who taught us to speak truth to power." Cedar Grove's story began appearing in textbooks and training manuals. Law enforcement agencies studied it as an example of how corruption can take root in small communities and how it can be overcome. Social workers used it to teach about recognizing signs of abuse and the importance of early intervention. The town's healing wasn't just about new programs and policies. It was about changing hearts and minds. Former Miller supporters, who had initially defended him out of loyalty or denial, now worked the hardest to make amends. They volunteered at the youth center, spoke at schools, and shared their stories of how blind trust can enable evil. The annual town festival, once a showcase of surface-level harmony, became a genuine celebration of community vigilance and support. Awards were given to students who demonstrated courage in standing up for others. Local businesses sponsored scholarships for young people pursuing careers in public service and advocacy. Maria's mother never left Cedar Grove, though many expected her to. "This is where the change needs to happen," she would say. Her strength inspired others, and gradually, the town that had failed her daughter became a place where such a tragedy could never happen again. The new generation growing up in Cedar Grove lent a different kind of trust, not blind faith in authority, but faith in their own ability to recognize right from wrong. They learned that real strength lies not in keeping secrets, but in having the courage to speak the truth. As Cedar Grove approached the 10th anniversary of the tragedy, plans were made not for a somber memorial, but for a forum on community empowerment. The town had learned that the best way to honor the past was to protect the future. The story of Cedar Grove became more than a cautionary tale. It became a blueprint for change. Other communities facing similar challenges looked to this small town for guidance on how to rebuild trust and protect their young people. In the end, Cedar Grove's transformation proved that even the deepest wounds can heal when a community chooses to face its failures honestly and work together toward real change. The town would never forget, but it had learned to use its pain as fuel for positive transformation. The final lesson of Cedar Grove was simple but powerful. Silence protects the wrong people. Real change begins when ordinary people find the courage to speak up, stand together, and demand better for their community.